Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide restless secrets and ordinary afternoons turn unexpectedly dark. Tonight, we step gently into St. Mary Mead, where a small fire in a cottage grate sets whispers moving through lace-curtained windows. Pour yourself a cup of tea, settle back, and listen closely, because in this village, the smallest detail can change everything, and nothing burns without leaving a trace. Chapter 1. "Did you notice?" Mrs. Prentice said in a voice that was meant to be discreet but carried perfectly well across the hedge, that the smoke was not gray at all, but quite black, as though something stubborn refused to burn. It was on that mild and otherwise unremarkable afternoon that St. Mary Mead first found itself standing in a loose semicircle outside Rosebank Cottage, drawn together not by invitation but by instinct. The village had always possessed a curious sensitivity to disturbance. A dropped teacup, a raised voice behind drawn curtains, a stranger walking too quickly along the lane. Each could ripple outward, until every doorstep hummed with speculation. A curl of dark smoke rising from a chimney at an unusual hour was quite sufficient to empty half the cottages within minutes. Miss Marple, who had been trimming a rose that showed signs of black spot, paused at the faintest scent of burning. She did not hurry. She set down her shears with care, brushed soil from her fingertips, and stepped to her garden gate. From there she had a clear view of Rosebank's sloping roof and the narrow chimney that, at present, breathed out smoke more forcefully than one would expect on so temperate a day. The fire, as it transpired, was small and contained within the sitting-room grate. It had not reached the curtains beyond a slight scorching at the hem, nor had it troubled the modest carpet more than a faint dusting of ash. Yet the fuss surrounding it suggested a far greater calamity. Mr. Alistair Dane himself stood in the doorway as though guarding entry to a vault rather than a cottage, his usually composed features sharpened by something that did not resemble mere irritation. Miss Marple watched him with quiet interest. He thanked Mr. Ellis for fetching water. He reassured Mrs. Linton that no damage had been done. He even smiled, though the expression hovered too briefly upon his face. But when Mrs. Prentice, eager as ever, made to step inside for a closer look, Mr. Dane's hand moved quickly to block her path. The gesture was polite, yet unmistakably firm. "It was nothing at all," he insisted. "A draft caught the papers. Quite my own foolishness." "Papers," Miss Marple noted. "Not kindling. Not an old newspaper. Papers." Mrs. Prentice, who prided herself on a sensitive nose, leaned closer to Miss Marple at the gate. "It was sealing wax," she murmured. "I know the scent. My sister in Bath uses it on her Christmas letters. There's a sweetness to it beneath the smoke." Miss Marple inclined her head. Sealing wax was not often employed for trivial correspondence these days. It suggested something formal, perhaps something personal. She said nothing, only watched as Mr. Dane turned, almost abruptly, to re-enter his cottage. His coat sleeve bore a faint smudge of soot near the cuff, not the scattered specks of a man tending an ordinary fire, but a darker impression, as though he had thrust his arm deep into the grate with urgency. There was a small tremor in his fingers when he closed the door, a tremor he seemed unaware of. The villagers lingered. Lingering, in St. Mary Mead, was a communal art. Mr. Ellis discussed chimney flues. Mrs. Linton spoke in sympathetic tones about unpredictable drafts. Timothy Green, who had arrived breathless from the post office, announced that he had seen no smoke earlier that morning, which meant the fire must have begun recently. Each remark, however mild, added another layer of attention. Miss Marple observed how Miss Dane's gaze drifted repeatedly toward the hearth inside the cottage, as though confirming the absence of something. It was not the singed curtain that troubled him, nor the inconvenience of gossip. It was something else entirely. Something that had been in those flames. When at last the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple waited a respectful interval before crossing the lane. She did not knock immediately. Instead, She paused by the low hedge that bordered Rosebank's modest front garden. The roses there were new plantings, not yet settled. One bush had been disturbed, the soil at its base pressed unevenly, as if someone had stepped too close in haste. Only then did she tap lightly upon the door. Mr. Dane opened it after a moment, his composure restored but not entirely convincing. Up close, his face appeared paler than usual, the skin about his eyes slightly tightened. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "I assure you, there is no cause for alarm." "I am so glad to hear it," she replied gently. "A small fire can be quite startling, particularly when one is alone." He hesitated at that word. Alone. "It was merely an old letter," he said, with a careful casualness. "I thought to destroy it. The draft caught it before it had properly burned." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Letters can be surprisingly resilient." She stepped just far enough inside to glimpse the hearth. The ashes had been stirred vigorously, too vigorously for such a minor mishap. A poker lay askew upon the fender, and beneath it, half hidden against the edge of the rug, there rested a small, blackened fragment that did not match the gray ash surrounding it. Mr. Dane shifted slightly, blocking her view. "One becomes careless," he added. "Old correspondence has a way of cluttering the mind." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "It does." She did not press further. Instead, she inquired after his settling into the village, remarked upon the kindness of the grocer, and commented upon the agreeable weather. Throughout this gentle exchange, she watched his eyes. They were attentive, but not relaxed. Each sound from the grate, a settling ember, the faint crackle of cooling coal, seemed to draw his attention like a magnet. When she finally excused herself, she did so with a smile that conveyed nothing but neighborly concern. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting Rosebank's windows in a warmer glow, yet the air retained that faint, sweet undertone Mrs. Prentice had described. Sealing wax. It was Mrs. Linton who found the fragment later, though she would claim she had not been searching at all. She had returned to offer Mr. Dane a jar of gooseberry jam and, upon placing it upon the sideboard, noticed the dark scrap near the fender. It had slipped from beneath the edge of the rug, perhaps dislodged by the earlier commotion. By the time word reached Miss Marple, carried with eager solemnity by Mrs. Prentice, the fragment had been examined by no fewer than 5 pairs of eyes. It bore the charred corner of an envelope. Most of it had succumbed to flame, yet along one edge 2 letters remained faintly visible. "L." "Eleanor?" suggested Mrs. Prentice at once. "Or perhaps Elizabeth or Elsie," offered Mrs. Linton, though she spoke more quietly. Miss Marple took the fragment between her fingers with delicate care. The paper was of good quality, thicker than ordinary post. Along the torn edge she detected the faint ridge where wax had once sealed it. It had not been a flimsy note dashed off in haste. It had been prepared with intention. "Curious," she murmured. Timothy Green, who had appointed himself a useful observer, volunteered that a woman in a dark blue coat had been seen approaching Rosebank earlier that day. She had walked briskly, head lowered, and had not acknowledged his greeting. He was certain of the coat's color, for it had struck him as particularly fine. Miss Marple listened. She did not interrupt. But she remembered that Mr. Dane had told her he was alone when the draft caught the paper. Alone. The difference between being alone and having been alone moments earlier was, she reflected, sometimes quite significant. That evening, as twilight softened the outlines of the cottages, Miss Marple sat by her window with a cup of tea. From there, she could see Rosebank's lamplight flicker to life. Mr. Dane moved across the curtained shadow, once, twice, pausing by the hearth again. Even at a distance, there was something restless in the movement. In St. Mary Mead, letters were rarely burned without discussion. They were kept in drawers, tied with ribbon, or tucked into biscuit tins beneath beds. They were preserved for sentiment or for leverage. To burn one outright, and to do so clumsily, suggested urgency. Miss Marple considered the letters she herself had received over the years. Some had brought joy, others had brought disappointment, but none had required such haste as to risk drawing half the village to one's doorstep. The fragment lay now upon her small table, entrusted to her for safekeeping until it might be properly discarded. She turned it gently in the lamplight. The ink of the L had blurred slightly from heat, yet remained legible enough to invite speculation. L. A name? A place? The beginning of an appeal? Outside, a faint breeze stirred the leaves. Somewhere down the lane a door closed with quiet finality. The village settled into its evening rhythm. Teacups washed, curtains drawn, lamps lit against the coming dark. And yet, beneath that calm, Miss Marple felt the first tremor of something unresolved. Fires and grates were ordinary. Letters were ordinary. But the look in Mr. Dane's eyes when he believed himself unobserved, that was not ordinary at all. She set the fragment down and folded her hands lightly in her lap. People often believed that destruction erased consequence, that a flame, once fed, would consume not only paper but memory. They underestimated, she thought, the stubbornness of truth. For even in ash, something remained. A scent. A smudge. 2 incomplete letters refusing to vanish. And as she gazed out toward the faint glow of Rosebank Cottage in the distance, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest, kindest smile. For she knew with quiet certainty that the fire had not ended anything at all. It had begun something. And somewhere within those drifting ashes she sensed lay the first unmistakable hint of danger. Chapter 2. I always say, Mrs. Linton began, leaning forward as though about to confess something dreadful, that when a gentleman tries too hard to appear calm, it is usually because he is not. The vicarage drawing room was particularly warm that afternoon. The fire lit more for comfort than necessity. Outside, the sky had softened into a pale blue, and the air held the faint promise of spring. Inside, however, the conversation was entirely fixed upon the small but memorable disturbance at Rosebank Cottage. Tea was being poured with unusual attentiveness, cups lifted and replaced with delicate precision, as though each clink of china might punctuate a theory. Miss Marple sat near the window, where she could both observe and remain slightly apart. She had chosen a seat that allowed her to see each face in profile when they turned to speak. It was often in profile, she believed, that truth revealed itself most plainly. The tightening of a jaw, the faint compression of lips, the small hesitation before a reply. Mrs. Linton, whose nerves were as transparent as her teacups, had taken it upon herself to recount her visit to Rosebank after the fire. I merely meant to offer assistance, she explained, though no one had suggested otherwise. One must support a new resident. It would look terribly unkind not to. And how did he seem? Asked Mrs. Prentice eagerly. Oh, composed, Mrs. Linton replied. Then, after the slightest pause, very composed. Miss Marple noticed that pause. It lingered just a fraction too long. Mrs. Linton went on to describe the sitting room. The hearth had been thoroughly cleaned. Too thoroughly, perhaps. There was hardly a trace of ash, she said. It was as though the fire had never happened at all. How efficient, murmured Miss Marple gently. Yes, efficient, Mrs. Linton echoed, though her tone suggested something less approving than the word implied. And yet, the air still carried that odd scent. Sealing wax, Mrs. Prentice supplied promptly. Miss Marple lifted her cup and took a thoughtful sip. Sealing wax had a sweetness to it, almost nostalgic, It belonged to formal letters, to invitations, to documents that required certainty. It did not belong to casual correspondence tossed carelessly into a grate. Timothy Green, who had been permitted to remain in the corner with a biscuit, contributed his observation once more. "The lady in blue looked upset," he said. She walked quickly. Didn't look at anyone. Miss Marple's gaze shifted subtly toward Mrs. Linton at that remark. The older woman's fingers tightened around her saucer, causing a faint rattle that she quickly disguised with a cough. "Did she now?" Mrs. Linton said, with a brightness that did not quite convince. "Well, visitors are not uncommon. Not so early in the day," Miss Marple observed softly. The room quieted for just a moment. It was not an accusation. It was merely an observation, yet it settled among them like a folded note slipped quietly onto a table. After tea, Miss Marple decided upon a small errand that would carry her naturally past Rosebank Cottage. She had no wish to appear intrusive. Curiosity, when too openly displayed, tended to close doors rather than open them. Instead, she walked at her usual measured pace, pausing once to admire a row of early crocuses that had begun to show their color. Mr. Dane was in his garden when she approached, though he did not appear to be tending it. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the soil as though expecting it to answer him. "Good afternoon," she called pleasantly. He turned, and for the briefest second, something like alarm crossed his face before smoothing into civility. "Miss Marple. A fine day, it is indeed. I was admiring your roses yesterday. They will take time to settle, of course." "Yes," he said quickly. "Yes, of course." His tone had shifted. There was an edge to it now, faint but perceptible, like glass under strain. She allowed a gentle silence to fall between them. Silence, she knew, often invited explanation. "I trust there was no further trouble with the hearth?" she asked. "None at all," he replied. "It was a foolish impulse. Old papers. Best forgotten." "Forgotten," she repeated lightly. "And yet they must once have been remembered." His eyes flickered toward the cottage window. It was a small movement, easily missed. But Miss Marple did not miss it. "Some memories are burdens," he said at last. "Indeed," she agreed. "Though it is remarkable how they persist." She noticed then the faint smudge still visible upon his cuff. He had changed his jacket, but the shirt beneath bore a shadow of soot near the wrist. A man who had thoroughly cleaned his hearth had not taken equal care with his clothing. That inconsistency struck her as curious. As they spoke, Mrs. Prentice appeared at the far end of the lane, walking with deliberate slowness. She pretended to examine the hedgerow, though her ears were plainly attuned to every word. Mr. Dane noticed her too. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It is astonishing," Miss Marple said conversationally, "how swiftly news travels in a village." He gave a tight smile. "Yes, one cannot sneeze without an audience." "And yet," she continued gently, "it is often the smallest incidents that carry the most significance." He did not reply to that. Instead, he excused himself, claiming a prior engagement in the village. Miss Marple watched him walk away. His stride was steady, but there was a haste beneath it, a slight forward lean as though he wished to outpace his own thoughts. Later that afternoon, at the grocer's shop, she overheard another fragment of conversation. Mrs. Ellis mentioned that Mr. Dane had withdrawn a considerable sum of money from the bank that very morning, before the fire. "For household expenses," she said, though her eyebrows suggested doubt. Money withdrawn. A letter delivered by hand. A fire in the grate before luncheon. The pieces did not yet align, but they rested uneasily beside one another. Miss Marple purchased her tea and sugar with customary politeness, then lingered just long enough to observe the subtle exchange of glances between Mrs. Ellis and Mrs. Prentice. There was excitement there, but also something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even unease. As evening approached, she received a quiet visitor. Mrs. Linton arrived, ostensibly to return a borrowed book, though the volume remained firmly under her arm as she spoke. "I cannot explain it," Mrs. Linton confessed, lowering her voice. When Timothy mentioned the lady in blue, Mr. Dane's expression changed. Only for a moment, but it did. Changed in what way? Miss Marple asked softly, as though he had hoped she would not be noticed. That, Miss Marple thought, was an interesting choice of words. They spoke a while longer, circling the subject without quite touching it directly. Mrs. Linton admitted that she had glimpsed a small burn upon Mr. Dane's writing desk, separate from the hearth entirely. A stray ember, perhaps. Or perhaps a page that had been set alight before being thrust hurriedly into the grate. When Mrs. Linton departed, Miss Marple remained seated by her small table, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the charred fragment, bearing those two incomplete letters. L. She considered the names in the village that began so. Eleanor Blake lived at the edge of St. Mary Mead, a widow of modest means and dignified bearing. Elizabeth Carter, though, had moved away years ago. Elsie Grant was hardly the type to exchange sealed letters. Eleanor. Miss Marple recalled seeing a dark blue coat hanging upon Eleanor Blake's hall stand the previous Sunday at church. It had been well made, slightly worn at the cuffs. The air outside had grown cooler. Lamps flickered on one by one along the lane. Somewhere in the distance, a gate clicked shut. She leaned back in her chair, allowing her thoughts to move with quiet patience. People rarely burned letters without reason. They burned them to conceal, to protect, or to prevent. Yet haste betrayed anxiety. And anxiety suggested pressure. If Mr. Dane had received a letter that morning, one sealed with care, delivered by hand, and urgent enough to require immediate destruction, then the visit from the woman in blue was unlikely to have been coincidence. But what had the letter contained? A request? A warning? A demand? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene. She had learned long ago that truth seldom announced itself loudly. It slipped instead through domestic details, through tremors in teacups and soot upon cuffs, through remarks made too quickly, and smiles held a shade too tightly. And as she looked out toward the darkened silhouette of Rosebank Cottage, she felt the faintest tightening in her chest. Not fear, but anticipation. For if a letter had been burned in such urgency, and if a name beginning with L had been nearly erased, then someone in St. Mary Mead had reason to prefer silence over explanation. And Miss Marple, listening to the hush settling over the village, knew with quiet certainty that the silence would not hold for long. Chapter 3. She has not worn that coat since last winter, Mrs. Prentice said in a tone that suggested she had been waiting all morning to share the detail. And yesterday, of all days, she chose it. It was remarkable how swiftly the identity of the woman in blue settled upon the village like a thin layer of dust. Light, pervasive, impossible to ignore. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had reached a quiet consensus that the visitor seen approaching Rosebank Cottage before the fire must have been Mrs. Eleanor Blake. There were other blue coats in existence, of course, but none so distinctly cut. None so frequently observed hanging upon the polished stand in Eleanor's modest hallway. Miss Marple received this conclusion with mild interest, and no outward surprise. She had risen early, as was her habit, and had already taken note of the slight increase in foot traffic along the lane. People walked more slowly when they wished to be seen walking casually. They paused at hedges that required no trimming. They greeted one another with excessive brightness. At 10:30, Miss Marple set out with the entirely innocent intention of returning a small dish that had once contained Eleanor Blake's lemon biscuits. The dish had been washed and dried the previous evening, and Miss Marple carried it now with gentle care, her expression composed and pleasant. Eleanor's cottage stood at the edge of the village, where the hedgerows grew a little thicker, and the road curved inward as though hesitating to continue. It was a neat home, though modest. The curtains were always freshly laundered, and the brass knocker polished to a soft glow. That morning, however, the curtains remained partially drawn despite the brightness of the day. Miss Marple tapped lightly upon the door. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to register. Then the latch turned, and Eleanor Blake appeared. She was as she always had been, composed, dignified, her hair drawn back in a style that suited her quiet bearing. Yet something in her eyes seemed less settled than usual. They flickered briefly past Miss Marple's shoulder, as though confirming that no one else had accompanied her. "My dear Miss Marple," Eleanor said, managing a faint smile. "How thoughtful. I could not possibly keep your dish any longer." Miss Marple replied warmly. "Your biscuits were quite irresistible." Eleanor stepped aside to admit her, and as Miss Marple entered, she observed at once the dark blue coat hanging upon the stand. It had not been returned to its usual place at the back, but rested closer to the front, as though recently removed and not yet properly arranged. The cuffs bore the faintest trace of soot along one edge. "You have been busy," Miss Marple remarked gently, allowing her gaze to drift toward the coat only briefly. Eleanor followed her glance and reached for the fabric with quick fingers. "Oh, this old thing. I had it out for mending." "Mending," Miss Marple echoed softly. They moved into the small sitting room, where a teapot already waited upon a tray. Eleanor poured with steady hands, though the cup trembled just slightly against the saucer before she steadied it. "It has been quite a topic of conversation," Miss Marple observed in a tone that suggested no judgment. "The little fire." Eleanor's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, unfortunate. You visited Rosebank that morning, I believe?" Eleanor's eyes met hers. There was no defiance there, only calculation. "I did. A matter of charity." Mr. Dane had expressed interest in contributing. "And did he?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes." The reply came swiftly. Too swiftly. He promised to consider it. "Ah." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And you left before luncheon?" "Shortly before," Eleanor answered. Her voice held firm, but there was a dryness to it, as though each word required careful placement. Miss Marple allowed a small silence to settle between them. Silence was rarely empty. It often coaxed the truth toward the surface. "I am told," she said at last, "that the letter delivered that morning was sealed." Eleanor's hand paused mid-motion. Only for a second. Then she set her cup down carefully. "Letters are often sealed," she said. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, though not all are burned. The words were spoken gently, almost idly, yet they hovered in the air with unmistakable weight. Eleanor's gaze shifted toward the hearth, where a modest fire burned low. "Some things are best destroyed." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Destroyed," she repeated. "Or concealed?" A faint flush rose along Eleanor's cheekbones. "I do not understand your meaning." "I am quite certain you do," Miss Marple replied softly, though her smile remained kind. Outside, a cart rattled faintly along the lane. Somewhere nearby, a gate creaked open and shut. The ordinary sounds of village life continued, yet within the small cottage the air had grown subtly tense. "I once knew a woman," Miss Marple said conversationally, "who believed that burning a letter would end its influence. She discovered, rather painfully, that the memory of its contents proved far more persistent than the paper itself." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. "You think I wrote that letter?" "I think," Miss Marple answered calmly, "that you had reason to deliver it by hand." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Her composure wavered, then steadied again. "We have known one another for many years," she said quietly. "Mr. Dane and I—" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That much is clear." Eleanor's lips pressed together. "There are histories that do not concern the village." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though when histories ignite small fires and grates, they do have a way of attracting attention. A flicker of something. Anger, perhaps, passed through Eleanor's eyes. "You believe I meant harm?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that you meant to be heard." The distinction lingered. Eleanor rose abruptly and crossed to a small writing desk near the window. She opened a drawer, then closed it again without retrieving anything. "He owed me," she said at last, her voice lower now. "Not money alone. An explanation." Miss Marple observed the desk carefully. The blotter bore a faint indentation, as though a letter had recently been written there with firm pressure. The inkstand was uncapped, the nib of the pen not fully cleaned. "And did he provide one?" she asked softly. Eleanor shook her head. "He promised he would." "Promised?" Miss Marple repeated. There was something in that word that settled uneasily. As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed another detail. Upon the edge of Eleanor's mantelpiece stood a framed photograph, recently repositioned. It depicted a seaside promenade, taken perhaps a decade earlier. Two figures stood close together, closer than mere acquaintances might stand. The man's profile, though younger, was unmistakably Mr. Dane. "You kept the photograph," Miss Marple remarked. Eleanor did not turn. "Some memories persist," she said quietly. The phrase echoed Mr. Dane's words from the previous day. Memories were burdens. Some things were best destroyed. Miss Marple rose slowly. "It is curious," she said, "how often the past demands payment." Eleanor faced her then, and for the first time the composure cracked entirely. "I did not set that fire," she said, almost pleading. "I left him alive." The statement hung between them. Miss Marple regarded her with steady kindness. "I have not suggested otherwise." Yet the fact that Eleanor felt compelled to clarify it was, in itself, revealing. When Miss Marple took her leave, the sky had shifted toward afternoon gold. She walked slowly back along the lane, her thoughts arranged carefully in her mind. Eleanor Blake had delivered a sealed letter by hand. She had spoken of being owed an explanation. She had insisted she left Mr. Dane alive. The cuffs of her coat bore faint soot, as though she had stood close to a fire, or to a hearth disturbed by haste. And yet, beneath her agitation, there had been something else. Not malice, not even resentment. There had been disappointment. Disappointment, Miss Marple reflected, could wound deeply. But it did not always lead to destruction. As she neared Rosebank Cottage once more, she paused at the gate. The curtains were drawn again, despite the lingering light. No movement showed within. A faint breeze stirred the hedges. Somewhere beyond the trees, a rook called sharply, breaking the quiet. Miss Marple rested her gloved hand upon the gatepost and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Eleanor had meant to be heard. Mr. Dane had meant to silence something. Between those two intentions lay the truth. And as the afternoon light faded and the village settled into its familiar rhythm, Miss Marple felt with quiet certainty that the fire had not been the end of a quarrel. It had been the beginning of something far more dangerous. Chapter 4. "It is always the quiet accounts that worry me most," Mrs. Prentice said in a lowered voice at the bakery counter. "The ones that look perfectly tidy from the outside." The remark drifted across the warm scent of fresh bread and settled gently in Miss Marple's mind. She had come in for a small loaf and a jar of marmalade. Yet she found herself lingering a moment longer than usual. Mrs. Prentice's tone held that careful balance between concern and anticipation that so often accompanied financial matters in St. Mary Mead. "Banking is such a complicated business," Mrs. Ellis added, brushing flour from her apron. One cannot always understand where money goes. Miss Marple did not join the speculation. Instead, she selected her change carefully and stepped back into the lane, allowing the faint chill of the morning air to clear her thoughts. Money had now entered the picture. Money withdrawn on the very morning of the fire. A sealed letter delivered by hand. A hurried attempt to burn it. When domestic disturbances intersected with financial adjustments, she had found in the past that explanations rarely proved simple. She had not gone far before she encountered Mr. Hollis, the village bank manager, emerging from his small office with a ledger tucked neatly beneath his arm. He was a tidy man, Mr. Hollis. His cuffs were always crisp, his shoes polished to an understated shine. He prided himself upon order. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said with practiced cheerfulness. "Good morning, Mr. Hollis. A brisk start to the day." "Indeed. One must keep ahead of figures, you know. They have a way of multiplying." He gave a short laugh at his own remark, though it ended a shade too abruptly. Miss Marple noticed a faint sheen at his temples despite the coolness of the air. "I am told," she said mildly, "that Mr. Dane called upon you recently." Mr. Hollis adjusted his grip on the ledger. "Many residents call upon me. Of course. Though I understand he made a rather substantial withdrawal. There it was again. That fractional pause. Barely perceptible, yet unmistakable. "Perfectly within his rights," Mr. Hollis replied, his voice smoothing over the words as though polishing them. "A private matter." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Privacy is often invaluable." He nodded, but his gaze flickered momentarily down the lane toward Rosebank Cottage. A small glance, swiftly corrected. Miss Marple wished him well and continued her walk, though her thoughts remained behind with that flicker of unease. Later that afternoon, she accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage. It was there that she heard, in careful tones, that Eleanor Blake had once received letters addressed not to Mrs. Blake, but to her maiden name, Eleanor Harwood. The detail had surfaced when the postman, in an uncharacteristic lapse, delivered one to the wrong doorstep and had to retrieve it with apologies. "People do not always leave their pasts behind," the vicar's wife remarked gently. "Sometimes they carry them in sealed envelopes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and sometimes those envelopes return." The conversation shifted, yet the thought lingered. Eleanor Harwood. Mr. Dane had lived in London for several years. Eleanor had spent time there before her marriage. Shared neighborhoods had been mentioned. Shared acquaintances, perhaps. Promises? After tea, Miss Marple made her way home by the longer path, the one that passed behind Rosebank's small garden. She had no intention of intruding, merely of observing. The soil near the back hedge had been disturbed. Not dramatically, but recently. A patch slightly darker than the surrounding earth. She paused as though admiring the rosebush, then bent delicately, her gloved fingers brushing aside a small clump of loosened soil. There, half buried and scarcely visible, lay a tiny scrap of blackened paper no larger than a postage stamp. She lifted it carefully. The edges were curled inward, but upon its surface she could just discern the faint impression of ink, an upward stroke of a capital letter. "A," she murmured under her breath. It was a slender clue, almost nothing. Yet, the fragment from the hearth had borne the beginning L. And here was a suggestion of a signature, perhaps, beginning with A. Allister. Had he signed something before thrusting it into the fire, or had another name been present entirely? She replaced the soil gently, leaving no sign of disturbance. Some truths preferred to remain hidden until coaxed into daylight. That evening, as the village lamps glowed softly against the encroaching dusk, Eleanor Blake was seen standing near the churchyard gate. She was not alone. A figure stood opposite her, half shadowed by the yew trees. Voices were low, indistinct, yet the posture between them conveyed urgency. Miss Marple, returning from evensong, slowed her pace without appearing to do so. She caught only fragments. "Cannot continue. You promised." If it becomes known. The second voice belonged unmistakably to a man. Calm, though edged. When Eleanor turned away, her composure appeared intact. Yet her steps carried a stiffness that betrayed strain. The man remained a moment longer in the shadows before stepping into the lamplight. It was Mr. Hollis. He adjusted his gloves with deliberate care and inclined his head politely when he saw Miss Marple. "A fine evening." "Very peaceful," she replied. "Yes, peaceful," he echoed. But there was no peace in the set of his jaw. As she walked on, Miss Marple considered the arrangement of pieces now forming before her. Eleanor had confronted Mr. Dane with a sealed letter. Mr. Dane had withdrawn a large sum of money. A fire had followed. Mr. Hollis, the bank manager, had spoken to Eleanor in hushed tones near the churchyard. Money, memory, and urgency were weaving themselves together. The following morning brought yet another small ripple. Mrs. Linton arrived at Miss Marple's door, bearing a dish of early plums and a whisper. "I saw Mr. Hollis leave Rosebank very early yesterday," she confided. "Before 8. He looked as though he had not slept." Miss Marple accepted the plums with thanks. "Did he now?" "Yes, and when he noticed me, he smiled far too broadly." Smiles, Miss Marple reflected, could be the most revealing of gestures. By midday, she had paid a polite call upon Mr. Hollis at the bank. The office was immaculate. Ledgers aligned precisely. The faint scent of ink and polished wood hung in the air. "Miss Marple," he said, rising quickly, "how may I assist you?" "I merely wish to clarify a small matter regarding a charitable subscription," she explained, offering a benign reason for her visit. As he retrieved a ledger, she observed his hands. They were steady, yet a faint tremor passed through them when he turned a page. The figures before him appeared orderly enough. Deposits, withdrawals, balances. Nothing overtly amiss. Yet there was something about the neatness that unsettled her. It was too complete, too symmetrical. As though care had been taken not only with the numbers themselves, but with the appearance of the numbers. Mr. Dane was quite interested in supporting parish repairs. She remarked lightly. "Yes, Mr. Hollis replied quickly. "A generous gentleman." "Indeed," she said, "though generosity sometimes carries expectation." He looked up, sharply. "Expectation?" "Of discretion," she added gently. The silence that followed stretched thin. When she departed the bank, the air outside felt cooler, though the sun shone brightly. She walked slowly home, her mind moving steadily through each exchange. Eleanor's insistence that she had left Mr. Dane alive. The soot upon her cuffs. The photograph on her mantel. Mr. Hollis's presence at the churchyard gate. The substantial withdrawal. The second fragment bearing a capital A. And beneath it all, the unmistakable scent of sealing wax. Letters did not ignite themselves. Nor did financial adjustments occur without cause. As evening settled once more upon St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window. Across the lane, Rosebank Cottage stood in stillness. No smoke rose now from its chimney. No visitors approached its door. Yet she felt with increasing certainty that the small fire in the grate had been less about destruction and more about concealment. Something had been removed. Something that linked not only Mr. Dane and Eleanor, but perhaps another entirely. She folded her hands gently in her lap, her expression thoughtful but serene. For when money and old promises met beneath the polite surface of village life, consequences seldom remained contained for long. And as the darkness deepened and the last lamplight flickered behind Rosebank's curtains, Miss Marple sensed that whatever had been buried, whether in ashes or in soil, would not remain hidden. Not for much longer. Chapter 5. "It is the quiet ones," Mrs. Prentice whispered, her hand pressed dramatically against her collarbone. who always leave the deepest shock. The news arrived just after dawn, carried not by smoke this time, but by the hurried steps of young Timothy Green racing along the lane. Doors opened before he even knocked. Curtains twitched. Within minutes, the calm rhythm of St. Mary Mead fractured into hushed clusters of disbelief. Mr. Alistair Dane had been found lifeless in his sitting room at Rosebank Cottage. Miss Marple did not rush. She never did. She placed her teacup carefully upon its saucer, adjusted her gloves, and stepped into the morning air, which felt strangely crisp despite the pale sun. The village had already begun gathering at a respectful distance from the cottage gate. Respectful, yet intensely attentive. The constable stood near the doorway, speaking in low tones with the doctor. Both men wore expressions of professional restraint, though there was a tightness about the doctor's mouth that suggested something more than an ordinary passing. Miss Marple paused beside Mrs. Linton, who appeared pale but eager to recount what she had heard. "They say he was seated quite normally," she murmured, as though he had simply drifted off. "And was there no sign of distress?" Miss Marple asked softly. "None." Only Mrs. Linton hesitated. "Only the teacup beside him." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "The teacup?" "Yes. Half finished." Tea, she thought. A domestic detail, small yet intimate. Tea shared or prepared alone. Tea that carried, perhaps, more than warmth. When the constable permitted a few neighbors to step briefly inside, purely to confirm that no intrusion had occurred, Miss Marple entered with the calm composure of one accustomed to observing without interfering. The sitting room bore little sign of disturbance. The hearth was clean, the grate carefully arranged. Too carefully. The air, however, carried a faint scent that did not belong entirely to coal or ash. It was subtle, almost sweet, lingering beneath the ordinary smells of the room. Miss Marple inhaled lightly. Bitter almonds. A whisper of it. Mr. Dane sat in his armchair, his posture not collapsed but stilled. His expression was not contorted by pain, rather, it seemed caught mid-thought. The teacup rested upon the small side table beside him. A thin residue clung to the porcelain, slightly darker than tea alone might leave. "How very unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. The doctor cleared his throat. "It appears to have been sudden. No marks. No struggle. Was he alone?" she asked gently, "as far as we can determine." But Miss Marple noticed the faint indentation upon the cushion opposite his chair. Slight. Recent. As though someone had sat there not long before. Mrs. Prentice leaned toward her. "He was seen at the bank yesterday afternoon," she whispered. "Quite agitated, they say." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the writing desk near the window. The blotter was clean, but the pen lay uncapped. Beside it, an envelope rested untouched upon the desk, its flaps sealed, its edges pristine. "Was that found so?" she asked quietly. "Yes," the constable replied. Unopened. Miss Marple stepped closer without appearing to do so. The envelope bore no soot, no scorch, yet it lay near the hearth, positioned with deliberate neatness. A letter not burned. A letter preserved. She did not touch it. Instead, she allowed her eyes to trace the surface. The handwriting differed from that. On the charred fragment, she still kept it home. This script was firmer, more angular. "Has anyone called upon him this morning?" she asked. "Mrs. Blake?" Mrs. Linton breathed. "She arrived just after 8. Found the door unlatched." Eleanor Blake stood now near the window, her face pale but composed. She wore no blue coat today. Instead, a simple gray shawl rested upon her shoulders. "I came to speak with him," she said quietly, when Miss Marple approached. "He had not replied to my note. Your note? Miss Marple echoed. Yes, I sent one yesterday afternoon. By post? No. I left it here. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the writing desk. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Eleanor had delivered a sealed letter by hand the previous day, the one that had burned, and now she claimed to have left another note. Yet the envelope upon the desk bore handwriting that did not resemble hers. You found him yourself? Miss Marple asked gently. Yes. The door was not fully closed. I called out. There was no answer. Her voice did not waver, though her hands tightened slightly within the folds of her shawl. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more about the room. The hearth had been swept clean again. No stray ash remained upon the rug. The poker lay aligned precisely along the fender. Order imposed after chaos. She knelt briefly beside the small table, adjusting her glove as though straightening it. From that vantage point, she could see that the teacup bore not only residue, but a faint ring upon the saucer beneath, as though it had been lifted and replaced twice. Did he take sugar? She asked suddenly. The doctor blinked. Sugar? Yes, in his tea. I believe not, Mrs. Linton replied uncertainly. He mentioned once that he preferred it plain. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. On the tray near the sideboard, the sugar bowl stood undisturbed. Its lid rested perfectly aligned. Yet the spoon beside the teacup bore the faintest trace of granules clinging to its surface. A small domestic inconsistency. She rose smoothly. How terribly sad, she said. Outside, the murmurs of the village swelled and softened in waves. Some spoke of sudden illness, others of strain. A few, more daring, mentioned the fire of the previous day. It is too much of a coincidence, Mrs. Prentice whispered. A letter burned, money withdrawn. And now this. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched Mr. Hollis approach the gate. His expression was grave, suitably concerned. Yet as his eyes met Eleanor's across the small crowd, there passed between them something sharper than grief. You heard? He asked her quietly. Yes, Eleanor replied. The exchange lasted only seconds. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of Mr. Hollis's jaw. Inside once more, the constable began making notes. The unopened envelope was carefully lifted and examined. Its seal bore no wax, merely adhesive, practical, unadorned. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. What is? The constable asked politely. That this letter remained intact, she replied, her tone mild. After yesterday's enthusiasm for burning correspondence. The constable frowned slightly, but said nothing. As the doctor prepared to depart, he remarked in low tones that a fuller examination would clarify matters. Though it appears to be a sudden collapse. Miss Marple inclined her head. Sudden, perhaps, but not without preparation. When at last she stepped back into the lane, the morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows from the hedgerows. The village hummed with subdued agitation. Mrs. Linton approached her once more. You do not believe it was natural, she said quietly. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. I believe, she answered gently, that yesterday's fire was not the conclusion of a difficulty. And today? Today, Miss Marple said, her gaze drifting toward the closed curtains of Rosebank Cottage. We have seen its consequence. She walked home slowly, her thoughts aligning like the careful pages of a ledger. The scent in the room, the sugar granules upon the spoon, the untouched envelope placed too neatly beside the hearth, the indentation upon the opposite cushion, Eleanor's early arrival, Mr. Hollis's measured composure. Tea, she reflected, was such a simple ritual, so ordinary, and yet it provided opportunity. Opportunity for conversation, for reconciliation, or for quiet intervention. The bitter almond scent lingered in her memory. Faint, but unmistakable. By the time she reached her gate, She felt the weight of certainty settling gently upon her shoulders. The small fire had not destroyed what it intended. Instead, it had illuminated something far more perilous. She paused before entering her cottage and glanced once more toward Rosebank. The hearth had been swept, the ashes removed, the letters reduced to fragments. But truth, she knew, did not vanish so obediently. And as the village attempted to reassure itself with talk of sudden illness and unfortunate timing, Miss Marple felt the quietest stirring of conviction that Mr. Dane's death had not been an accident of frailty. It had been arranged, and somewhere between the burned letter and the untouched envelope, the hand that arranged it waited, composed and patient, believing itself unseen. Chapter 6. "It is the garden that troubles me," Mrs. Linton confided the next morning, her voice lowered as though the roses themselves might overhear. He never seemed the gardening sort. And yet the soil behind the hedge looks as though it has been turned twice over. Miss Marple received this observation with a thoughtful incline of her head. Gardens, she had long believed, revealed far more than their owners intended. They bore the marks of restlessness, of distraction, of sudden decisions made in haste. A rosebush planted too deeply, a patch of earth disturbed without reason. Such things rarely escaped her notice. The morning carried a gentle brightness, though the village itself felt subdued beneath the shadow of Mr. Dane's passing. Doors opened more quietly. Greetings were exchanged with softer tones. Yet beneath the outward sympathy, curiosity thrived. Miss Marple chose the longer path once again, the one that curved discreetly behind Rosebank Cottage. She paused as though admiring the modest garden, though her eyes were attentive to subtler details. The soil near the back fence, which she had noticed days before, appeared darker still. Recently pressed down, yet not entirely settled. She bent slightly, adjusting her glove, and allowed her fingers to brush the surface. The earth yielded too easily. Something beneath it resisted gently, metallic against her touch. With delicate care, she uncovered a small metal clasp, no larger than that of a document case. It lay partially embedded, as though hurriedly covered. She lifted it free. The leather to which it had once attached was gone, but the clasp itself bore faint scratches, recent ones. Miss Marple replaced the soil carefully, smoothing it with a gardener's practiced hand. The clasp she slipped into her reticule without comment. "Looking for something?" came a voice from beyond the hedge. She straightened slowly to find Mr. Hollis standing a short distance away, his expression polite but guarded. "Only admiring the roses," she replied gently. "They seem to have been moved." "Mr. Dane was particular about appearances," he said, stepping closer. "He valued order." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Order can be most reassuring." Mr. Hollis's gaze drifted briefly to the patch of soil before returning to her face. "It has been a distressing week. Indeed it has," she agreed. "One wonders what might have troubled him so deeply." He offered a tight smile. "Some matters are private." "And yet," she said softly, "privacy does not prevent consequences." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in his eyes. Irritation, perhaps, or unease. Then it vanished behind composure. As he took his leave, Miss Marple resumed her slow walk home, her thoughts arranging themselves with quiet precision. The metal clasp suggested a case once buried there. A document case, perhaps. One that had contained papers worth concealing. Later that afternoon, she invited Mrs. Linton for tea. It was always easier to gather information when one offered hospitality in return. Mrs. Linton arrived eager to share yet another observation. "I overheard something at the grocer's," she began, lowering herself into the chair opposite. "It seems Mr. Dane had been making regular payments to someone in the village." "Regular?" Miss Marple asked, pouring tea with steady hands. "Yes. Small sums, but frequent. The sort of arrangement that draws little notice." Miss Marple considered this. And do we know the recipient? Mrs. Linton hesitated. There is talk. Nothing confirmed. Talk often precedes confirmation, Miss Marple observed lightly. The vicar's wife had mentioned earlier that Eleanor Blake had once received correspondence under her maiden name. Eleanor Harwood. Payments to that name would attract little suspicion if discreetly arranged. Yet the clasp in Miss Marple's reticule suggested something more tangible. Bank drafts, perhaps, or agreements placed out of sight. As the afternoon wore on, another small ripple reached her ears. Mrs. Prentice, passing by the lane, remarked that she had seen Mr. Hollis leaving the bank late the previous evening, long after closing hours. He looked quite flushed, she said, as though he had been exerting himself. Exertion, in Mr. Hollis's case, seemed an unusual state. Miss Marple listened quietly. She did not encourage the gossip, yet she absorbed it. The pattern continued to form, each domestic detail fitting into place with increasing clarity. Before dusk, she called briefly upon Eleanor Blake. Eleanor received her with composed civility, though fatigue now lined her features. "I have nothing further to say," Eleanor stated softly, as though anticipating questions. "Of course not," Miss Marple replied kindly. "I wished only to ask after your well-being." They sat together in a silence that felt less strained than before. On the small table beside Eleanor's chair lay a folded paper, its edges worn from handling. "Did Mr. Dane ever explain himself?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor's gaze lowered. "He said he would make arrangements, that things would be resolved quietly." "Resolved," Miss Marple repeated. "Yes. He feared scandal more than anything. And did you?" Eleanor hesitated. "I feared being forgotten." The words carried a quiet weight. Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was resentment in Eleanor, certainly. Disappointment, perhaps even wounded pride. But there was no triumph in her expression now. No secret relief. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell upon the mantel once more. The seaside photograph remained in its place. Two figures standing close together beneath a striped awning. A promise captured in stillness. Outside, the evening air carried a faint chill. The church bell tolled softly in the distance. Miss Marple walked slowly, reflecting upon the distinction between emotional debts and financial ones. Emotional debts might fester quietly for years. Financial debts, however, demanded balancing. If Mr. Dane had been making payments, small, regular sums, someone had been receiving them. If those payments had been threatened, if exposure loomed, then desperation might follow. The bitter almond scent returned to her memory. The sugar upon the spoon. The untouched envelope placed too neatly beside the hearth. When she reached her cottage, she withdrew the small metal clasp from her reticule and examined it more closely. A faint engraving marked its inner edge. Initials almost worn away, yet still discernible. A.H. Not Alistair Dane. Eleanor Harwood. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her thoughts sharpened. A document case bearing Eleanor's maiden initials buried behind Rosebank Cottage. Why would Mr. Dane possess such an item? And why bury it rather than burn its contents? Unless the contents had been removed first. She set the clasp upon her small table and folded her hands beside it. Money had been withdrawn, letters had been burned, a document case had been hidden, and Mr. Hollis, guardian of the village accounts, had shown more agitation than grief. The garden soil had told its quiet story. The clasp had confirmed a connection. But one question lingered above all others. Who, among them, had most to lose if those documents resurfaced? As the evening deepened and shadows lengthened along the lane, Miss Marple felt the pieces drawing nearer to alignment. The truth lay not in dramatic gestures, but in small domestic inconsistencies. Sugar where none was taken. Soil disturbed without reason. Hands that trembled only when certain names were spoken. She gazed toward the darkened outline of Rosebank Cottage, its windows reflecting the last light of day. Somewhere within this quiet village, someone believed the matter concluded. The fire had burned. The tea had been poured. The earth had been smoothed flat. But Miss Marple, serene and patient, knew otherwise. For gardens rarely kept secrets forever. And neither, she suspected, would this one. Chapter 7. "It is extraordinary," Mrs. Prentice said softly, leaning closer across Miss Marple's small tea table. "How papers can vanish and yet leave such a strong impression." Miss Marple smiled faintly at that. Papers did vanish. They burned. They were buried. They were mislaid in drawers and tucked behind ledgers. And yet, the space they left behind often spoke louder than their presence ever had. The village had settled into a strange rhythm since Mr. Dane's passing. Outwardly, life continued. The baker rose before dawn. The postman made his rounds. The vicar prepared his sermon. But beneath that steady routine ran a thin current of anticipation, as though St. Mary Mead itself sensed that something unfinished lingered in its midst. Miss Marple had spent the early part of the morning at her writing desk, not composing letters, but arranging small fragments before her. The charred scrap bearing L, the metal clasp engraved with AH, and a sheet of paper upon which she had carefully noted dates: Mr. Dane's arrival in the village, the timing of certain withdrawals, Eleanor's visits, the evening Mr. Hollis had remained late at the bank. Patterns, she had often found, revealed themselves best when placed side by side. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Linton, her expression bright with nervous energy. "I do hope I am not disturbing you," she began, though she was already halfway inside. "But I have just remembered something most peculiar." "Peculiarities are rarely disturbances," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Do sit down." Mrs. Linton did so, smoothing her gloves before speaking. "On the afternoon before Mr. Dane was found, I passed the bank just before closing. Mr. Hollis was speaking with someone inside. The blinds were half drawn, but I am quite certain it was Mr. Dane." Miss Marple did not look surprised. "You are sure?" "Yes." And Mr. Dane appeared agitated. He gestured toward a ledger on the desk. "A ledger," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Mrs. Linton nodded, and Mr. Hollis seemed defensive, quite unlike his usual self. When Mrs. Linton departed, Miss Marple remained seated, her fingers lightly touching the charred fragment. The beginning of a name. The ending of a letter. A confrontation at the bank. A withdrawal of funds. A document case buried in soil bearing Eleanor Harwood's initials. It was time, she felt, to examine what had not been burned. Later that afternoon, she paid another visit to the bank, this time with an air of mild confusion about a subscription list for parish repairs. Mr. Hollis greeted her with impeccable courtesy, though the faint shadows beneath his eyes had deepened. "Such a trying week," he remarked. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "One feels the absence of a neighbor keenly." She allowed her gaze to wander idly across the desk. Ledgers were stacked with precision. Papers aligned, yet one drawer, just slightly misaligned with the others, caught her attention. "You keep excellent records, Mr. Hollis," she observed. "I pride myself upon it," he replied quickly. "And Mr. Dane's accounts?" she asked softly. "Were they equally tidy?" He hesitated. Only for a second. "Naturally." "Of course," she murmured. As he turned to retrieve a ledger, she noticed the faint tremor in his hand when he grasped the handle of the drawer. The drawer stuck momentarily before sliding open. Inside lay several documents, neatly clipped. Yet among them she glimpsed something folded more carelessly, a bank draft bearing a different name. Eleanor Harwood. Mr. Hollis closed the drawer swiftly. "Everything in order?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Perfectly, he replied, though his tone had grown tighter. She did not press further. Instead, she thanked him and departed, her suspicions no longer tentative but forming into clarity. That evening, she invited a small gathering to the vicarage drawing room under the pretense of discussing arrangements for Mr. Dane's memorial. Eleanor Blake attended, pale but composed. Mr. Hollis arrived promptly, his expression measured. Mrs. Linton and Mrs. Prentice took their seats with quiet eagerness. The atmosphere was gentle, almost subdued. Tea was poured. Polite remarks exchanged. And then, in her soft, confiding tone, Miss Marple began. "It is remarkable," she said, "how often misunderstandings arise from attempts to protect reputations." There was a slight shift in the room. Mr. Hollis's gaze sharpened. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. Mr. Dane, Miss Marple continued, was a man burdened by past promises. He had known Mrs. Blake, Miss Harwood, as she once was, in earlier years. A murmur passed lightly through the room. He had made arrangements, she went on, small payments over time. Perhaps to ease disappointment, perhaps to prevent talk. Eleanor's face flushed faintly, though she did not interrupt. But such arrangements require discretion on both sides, Miss Marple said gently, and discretion becomes difficult when accounts no longer balance. Mr. Hollis shifted in his seat. "I do not follow," he said carefully. Miss Marple turned her calm gaze upon him. Mr. Dane discovered irregularities. Not in his own funds, but within the broader accounts entrusted to the bank. Silence fell. "He confronted you," she continued softly. "In this very week, he had proof, documents removed from the bank and kept temporarily at his cottage. Documents bearing Miss Harwood's name, because the payments passed through her account before being redirected." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Redirected?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Mr. Hollis had been using Mr. Dane's regular payments to conceal shortages elsewhere. Small sums at first, then larger ones. When Mr. Dane examined his withdrawals more closely, he noticed discrepancies. Mr. Hollis rose abruptly. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked gently. The document case buried behind Rosebank bore Miss Harwood's initials. It had been emptied. The drafts removed. Eleanor's breath caught. "I never saw such documents." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed kindly. "You were unaware. Your past connection provided a convenient channel." Mr. Hollis's composure faltered. "Just briefly." "Mr. Dane intended to confront you formally," Miss Marple continued. "He withdrew funds to settle matters directly and demanded an explanation. When he received your reply, sealed, perhaps defensive, the discussion grew urgent." Mrs. Linton gasped softly. "The fire," Miss Marple said, her voice still warm, "was not meant to destroy Miss Harwood's letter alone. It was meant to destroy Mr. Dane's evidence." Mr. Hollis's jaw tightened. "You cannot prove." The second envelope found intact beside the hearth, Miss Marple interrupted gently, bore soot only upon its surface. It had been placed there after the flames had died. A small attempt to suggest confusion. Silence thickened. And when Mr. Dane refused to relent, she continued. "You visited him once more. Early." Under the pretense of discussion, her eyes drifted toward the memory of the teacup. He did not take sugar. Yet sugar was found upon the spoon. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. The faint scent in the room, Miss Marple added quietly, subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Hollis's face had grown pale now, the careful polish of his demeanor cracking beneath the weight of quiet truth. "You believed," Miss Marple concluded softly, "that by removing the documents and arranging matters to appear sudden, the problem would vanish. But accounts, like gardens, do not remain undisturbed. The room remained utterly still. Outside, the evening light faded gently against the windows. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, her expression composed and kind. "The truth," she said, "has a habit of balancing itself." And as Mr. Hollis stood rigid in the lamplight, his composure finally slipping beyond repair, it became clear to all present that the quiet village of St. Mary Mead had harbored not merely a burned letter or a troubled romance, but deliberate deception. And though the full reckoning had yet to unfold, Miss Marple knew with calm certainty that the final ember of this mystery was about to flare into undeniable flame. Chapter 8. It is always the smallest correction in a ledger that reveals the greatest error, Miss Marple said softly, as though she were remarking upon nothing more troubling than a misplaced decimal. The drawing-room at the vicarage felt unusually close that evening, though the fire burned low and steady. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay in a hush of anticipation. Word had spread, not in dramatic declarations, but in the subtle way the village shared its knowledge. A small gathering had formed, invited under the respectable pretense of discussing final arrangements for Mr. Dane's affairs. Yet everyone present understood that something more awaited them. Eleanor Blake sat near the window, her posture dignified, though her face bore the strain of recent days. Mrs. Linton and Mrs. Prentice occupied their customary chairs, hands folded, but eyes alert. The vicar himself stood by the mantel, his expression grave, and Mr. Hollis, the village bank manager, remained near the door, composed but watchful. Miss Marple took her seat quietly, her manner unhurried, as though she were merely about to recount a small domestic puzzle. "I have been thinking," she began gently, "about letters." No one interrupted. A letter may carry apology, accusation, or threat, but once written, it cannot entirely be undone. Even when burned, its existence remains. Her eyes drifted, almost idly, toward Mr. Hollis. The letter delivered to Rosebank that morning was not, as some believed, the true source of danger. It was a symptom. Eleanor shifted slightly, but said nothing. Mr. Dane had discovered something in the bank accounts, irregularities too consistent to be accidental. Small adjustments at first, transfers masked beneath routine entries, payments that passed briefly through Miss Harwood's account before being redirected elsewhere. A faint murmur stirred the room. Eleanor's eyes widened. "Redirected?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Without your knowledge." Your long-ago connection with Mr. Dane provided a convenient explanation for regular payments. It discouraged inquiry. Mr. Hollis's voice came cool and controlled. "This is conjecture." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked softly. "When Mr. Dane withdrew a significant sum the morning of the fire, he did so not to silence Miss Harwood, but to confront you. He had removed documentation from the bank, documentation that revealed the pattern." She paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle. "He kept those papers in a small case. The clasp bore Miss Harwood's maiden initials. He intended, I believe, to protect her from scandal by holding the evidence privately until he understood its full extent." Eleanor lowered her gaze, her breath unsteady. "The fire," Miss Marple continued, "was meant to destroy that evidence. You visited Rosebank after learning of his discovery. A discussion followed. Heated, perhaps." Mr. Hollis's composure flickered. "I visited to offer assistance after the fire." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But the fire had been your doing." The room fell utterly still. "You encouraged Mr. Dane to burn a letter, perhaps even helped feed the flames, so that in the confusion, the case and its contents might be removed. The hearth was disturbed too thoroughly, the ashes too evenly spread, and a fragment bearing only the beginning of Miss Harwood's name was conveniently left behind." Mrs. Prentice inhaled sharply, But when Mr. Dane refused to abandon his intention of confronting you formally, you faced a greater difficulty. Mr. Hollis's hands tightened at his sides. You visited again the following morning, Miss Marple said, her voice steady and warm. Early, before the village stirred. The door was not latched securely afterward. You spoke with him. Perhaps you attempted persuasion once more. And what of it? He demanded, the first crack in his restraint. What of it? She echoed gently. Is the teacup? She allowed her gaze to rest briefly upon the vicar's small tea tray, as though drawing a comparison. Mr. Dane did not take sugar, yet sugar was present upon the spoon beside his cup. The faint scent in the room, subtle, almost imperceptible, was not from coal. No one moved. You relied upon familiarity, she continued. Tea shared between acquaintances arouses no suspicion. A small addition, stirred discreetly, dissolves quickly. Eleanor's face had grown pale. And afterward, Miss Marple said softly, you placed an untouched envelope near the hearth. A suggestion of confusion. A hint that perhaps the previous day's chaos had unsettled him. Mr. Hollis let out a strained breath. You cannot prove any of this. Miss Marple inclined her head. Proof is often a matter of accumulation. Your late hours at the bank, the altered ledgers, the burial of the empty case behind Rosebank's hedge, and most of all, your manner. My manner? He repeated sharply. Yes, she said gently. You are a man devoted to order. Yet in recent days, your composure has required effort. You glanced at the garden soil when no one else did. You closed your drawer too quickly. You avoided Miss Harwood's eyes except when you sought to measure her silence. The silence that followed was heavy and inescapable. You believed, she said quietly, that by eliminating Mr. Dane, the discrepancies would remain hidden. That the small shortages would continue unnoticed. And if they had, Mr. Hollis asked bitterly, they were temporary. I intended to restore them. Intentions, Miss Marple replied softly, do not balance accounts. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice stripped of polish, Mr. Hollis said, he would have ruined everything. The bank. My position. My family's name. And so you chose, Miss Marple answered gently, to ruin far more. The vicar stepped forward quietly, his expression solemn. Outside, footsteps approached. The constable summoned discreetly before the gathering had begun. Mr. Hollis did not resist. The fight had drained from him, leaving only a weary resignation. Eleanor sat motionless, tears bright but unshed. I never knew, she whispered. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. You were used as a convenience. Your past connection provided camouflage. The constable guided Mr. Hollis toward the door. As it closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale collectively. For a time, no one spoke. At last, Mrs. Linton said faintly, it all began with a letter. Yes, Miss Marple replied softly. And with fear, she rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the village lay quiet beneath the early evening sky. Lamps flickered on one by one, steady and reassuring. Letters in a fire, she said gently, almost to herself, do not vanish as completely as one might hope. Ink leaves traces, ashes leave scent, and even the most careful deception cannot account for every small domestic detail. She turned back to the room, her expression serene. Mr. Dane made mistakes in his youth, she added, but he intended, at last, to correct them. It was that intention which proved dangerous. Eleanor drew a slow breath. And now? Now, Miss Marple said warmly, the truth has balanced the account. The gathering dispersed quietly, each person carrying away the weight of what had unfolded. Outside, the night settled gently over St. Mary Mead, calm restored in appearance, if not entirely in spirit. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer by the hearth, watching the small, steady flame within the grate. Fire could destroy. Certainly. But it could also illuminate. As she stepped into the cool evening air, she felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of order restored. For in the end, it had not been grand gestures that revealed the culprit, nor dramatic confrontations, but sugar where none was taken, soil disturbed without reason, and a ledger that tried too hard to appear perfect. And as she walked slowly home beneath the soft glow of lamplight, Miss Marple reflected that in a village such as hers, even the faintest ember could cast a long shadow. But truth, patient and persistent, would always outlast the flame. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness, as though St. Mary Mead itself had decided to breathe more slowly. There were practical matters first, of course. Officials came and went with measured politeness. Papers were examined, accounts reviewed, statements taken in calm, careful tones. The bank, once a place of unquestioned order, revealed its small fractures under scrutiny. Figures were corrected, gaps acknowledged. What had seemed neat and reliable was shown to have been delicately, deliberately altered. Yet the village did not speak of numbers for long. Villages rarely do. Instead, they spoke of lessons. Eleanor Blake withdrew from society for a short time, though not in disgrace. If anything, there was a softened sympathy toward her now. The old seaside photograph remained upon her mantel, but its meaning had shifted. It no longer represented a promise unfulfilled, but a chapter concluded. When at last she returned to church one Sunday morning, heads turned not in accusation but in quiet respect. She carried herself with dignity, and if there was sadness in her expression, there was also relief. Rosebank Cottage stood empty for several weeks. Its windows reflected the changing light of early spring, and the roses in the small garden began, stubbornly, to push out new leaves. The disturbed soil behind the hedge settled at last, as though the earth itself preferred smoothness to secrecy. Children passed the gate without slowing now. The air around it no longer felt charged. Miss Marple resumed her gentle routines. She walked the lane at her usual hour. She accepted invitations to tea. She listened more than she spoke. To the casual observer, nothing in her manner suggested she had untangled a web of deception that had nearly gone unnoticed. She did not dwell upon it. She never did. One mild afternoon, Mrs. Linton remarked, with a thoughtful shake of her head, it all seemed so ordinary at first. A small fire. A letter. One hardly imagined such things could lead to everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It is always the ordinary things that matter most, she said. People reveal themselves in small habits, in the way they stir their tea, in what they choose to burn or bury. The remark lingered gently between them, for that had been the heart of it. Not grand passion nor wild impulse, but fear of exposure, fear of losing position, fear that a tidy surface might be disturbed. And in trying to preserve appearances, Mr. Hollis had created a far greater ruin. As the weeks passed, the village returned to its familiar rhythm. The baker's bell rang each morning. The post arrived on time. Conversations drifted once more toward weather and parish fees. Yet something subtle had changed. There was, perhaps, a deeper awareness now. A quiet understanding that beneath even the calmest exterior, currents might run unseen. One evening, as dusk settled in soft shades of blue and gold, Miss Marple stood at her garden gate and looked down the lane toward Rosebank Cottage. A new tenant was expected soon. Life, she knew, would fill the rooms again with fresh voices and different concerns. She reflected, not with satisfaction but with gentle clarity, that truth had not emerged through force or accusation. It had come quietly, through sugar in a cup, a tremor in a hand, soil turned without need, through the smallest domestic inconsistencies that others dismissed. A letter had been thrown into fire in haste, but its shadow had remained. And in following that shadow, patiently, kindly, without spectacle, Miss Marple had restored what mattered most in St. Mary Mead. Not merely justice, but balance. The evening breeze stirred the hedges lightly. Somewhere nearby, a door closed with soft finality. And in the peaceful hush that followed, the village felt whole again.